session with Ms. Lottie Dowling, Manager of Going Global at MEG Languages. Over the last 20 years, Lottie has worked in education as a school practitioner and professional learning leader on global, national, and regional level. He has run networks of schools with educators working on pedagogical change and school improvement, facilitated educator development and intercultural understanding, global citizenship, and aspects of global competence. She has delivered professional learning in a range of contexts, including face-to-face and digitally, including through social media. Before Australia, she has actually spent 10 rewarding years working in both the public and private sectors in Beijing, China, and has worked in education in 6 countries around the globe, including as the manager of professional learning at Asia Education Foundation, and currently as the manager of Going Global at MEG Languages. So, please give a big round of applause to Ms. Lottie Dowling. Thank you, Ms. Lottie, for your participation. I will now give the stage to you.
Thank you so much for that very warm welcome, and thank you to the invitation from Swinburne University in Vietnam. I'm really thrilled to be here today and to be sharing some of the experience that I've been doing with schools. And I'm going to be sharing a framework today around leading for global competence. I love connecting with people doing this work, so if something is resonating, please do reach out to me. I've got my info at the end of the slide, and let me know about the work that you're doing in your space. I primarily work in schools, primary and secondary schools, but so much of this work does actually kind of translate across. So I'm going to share my screen now. As you heard in the introduction, I do work at MEG Languages. MEG Languages primarily provides Spanish and Chinese language programs to schools across many different countries: Australia, New Zealand, the UK, the USA, in Chinese and Spanish. But we also do global citizenship student programs and teacher development to support the work that is going on in schools. I lead that work in Going Global. And just a little bit about me, so you know who's presenting today. I had a lot of fun putting this together because it really made me reflect on my journey. So, I started off in New Zealand as a primary school educator working in primary schools in West Auckland. I moved on to teach and, travel and volunteer teach in different parts of the world, including in India. And this was a very special school near Varanasi that I did teacher capacity building as well as student teaching programs in as well. After that, I taught in London for a few years, and then I ended up spending 10 rewarding years in Beijing, China. I worked at an international school for 6 years, and then I moved on to a partnership with the Chaoyang District Bureau of Education, the internationalizing department, where we did pedagogical change in teaching English, teaching second language, where I looked after 7 primary schools, and this work was very, very rewarding. It gave me some real insights into intercultural learning and intercultural communication firsthand on the ground floor. I managed to travel quite a bit through Asia and through China during those 10 years and had some pretty amazing experiences traveling to sort of pretty distant places. This image here I've chosen, it's one of my favorite images. Me on the outside looking into, it's actually in the western part of China. It's a couple of young Muslim women in a sewing shop, and just me desperate to find out more about their worlds, but that barrier being there, and it's not a real intercultural experience, but you know, I'm sort of making those attempts for it to be. I came and moved to Australia where I worked at the Asia Education Foundation and led teacher professional learning trips to different countries, including India and the Kingdom of Bhutan, as well as student programs as well as a manager of professional learning. I'm now at MEG, and I do a lot of work in schools with educators and you know, school leaders as well. So today's session is called Leading for Global Competence. And as I said, I will be reflecting on my work that I have primarily done in schools, but this work really translates across. We'll be talking about strategic thinking, talking about deep learning goals, and then looking at essentially the approaches that institutions and schools can take. I would like to start off by acknowledging country. I am standing on the lands of the Wurundjeri and the Burudong peoples, and I acknowledge the Indigenous people that are joining us from any part of the globe, and just really, to acknowledge that, the lands that many of us are standing on are unceded lands. Okay, so the world we live in. The world we live in is complex, it's interconnected, and it's interdependent. And, this is the world that we're seeing in the media, but it's also the world that our young people are seeing as well. They have access to the media 24/7, just like us. There's pollution. And I've traveled and lived in some incredibly polluted cities in the world where AQIs are in the hundreds, the air quality indexes are in the hundreds, and seen the impact on people's lives. We are living through mass extermination and an extinction, unfortunately, of animals and our wildlife, like the Sumatran tiger. There's only around 400 of these left in the wild. There's polarization. Great polarization, and we're seeing this across the globe in protests, and that's leading to pushback from many different parties, including movements like the Black Lives Matter movement. And we're also seeing digital technologies. We're seeing AR and VR being used in schools already, and that is continuing to evolve and change really quickly. We've seen a war in Europe, which is something we've not seen in decades. That has been particularly shocking, I think, for many people, given it sort of felt like it came out of nowhere. At the same time, there are many, many global conflicts that are happening in different parts of the world at this time. Certainly not the only one, unfortunately. And of course, for the last 2 years, we've all unfortunately been living through a pandemic and continue to live in a pandemic. In our household, we've had COVID, and again for the second time in the last week. And this has had profound impacts on not only people's health, but the way that we work, the way that we educate, and the ripple effects across workplaces will continue for many, many years, and impacting on things like hybrid learning. So today we're talking about leading for global competence, because the world is so interconnected and interdependent, and we see with all of those things that the impact of one thing can impact on the other side of the world. Today, if you would like to find out more information about the framework that I'm using or the examples that I'm using, these are all part of an online self-paced module. You're welcome to access it. It is free. You just scan this little doodah and the QR code. We're all familiar with QR codes these days. I'll have it up again at the end of a session as well. And you can work through that module at your own pace. And you're welcome to share that with your colleagues. So today we're talking about leading for global competence. Now, when I talk about leading for global competence, I'm referring to the PISA framework model, which essentially has these sort of 4 stages to it. But also equally, you could be leading an institution or leading a school for global citizenship education. So it's not about the model that we're using. It's not about the definition that we're using. These two are slightly different, and today's session is not about the differences or the similarities between them, but this is what I'm talking about. It's providing platforms and an ecosystem for this work to take place, and not just one of these domains, not just examining local, global, and intercultural issues, but multiple opportunities and different ways to access all of this learning, all of these aspects of global competence. Okay, here I've got the definition of global citizenship education provided by UNESCO. So many of you will be very familiar with Fernando Remes, who is the Director of Global Education at Harvard University. And he defines global citizenship as understanding the forces, bringing the world together, having the capabilities to operate effectively across boundaries, and to address the challenges they create or seize the opportunities they afford. And I really love this definition because it talks not only about the challenges they create. When we think back to that previous slide with COVID and wars and pandemics, and all of these things that are happening, the extinction of animals, we also have opportunities. Okay, we can be creating dystopic worlds or utopic worlds. This is our choice as educators to provide those choices to our students and make sure they've got the skills to create utopic futures versus dystopic futures. So, what ways do we develop global competence or global citizenship in schools? And I imagine if you're watching this, you'd be thinking, okay, we do this and we do this and we do this. And probably some of the things that come up are language and culture programs, curriculum units of work. They're probably the two most common ways to do this work. These are deep learning opportunities for global competence or global citizenship. These are probably the two most common approaches that we do in schools, but they're certainly not the only ones that we do. Okay, so I'd like to show you in a moment the framework that I use that includes these two approaches, but also includes so many other ways and approaches. But why even have a framework to begin with? Why did I and did we at MEG create this framework? Well, in my 2 decades of work in schools, what I started to notice when I was looking at global citizenship or looking at global competence work was that many schools were doing amazing things. Many schools had educators really passionate about this work. Sometimes they were language educators that were doing this work through language and culture programs. Sometimes they were teachers who were doing this through a specific curriculum area or through cross-curriculum areas, which is sort of more common in primary school. So, some curriculum areas lend themselves more to global competence and citizenship education than others. For example, things like history, geography, even, through English, through text, this work can be more aligned to global competence work than something like mathematics necessarily. Of course, there's opportunities everywhere. But what we were seeing and what I was seeing was that there were educators in schools doing amazing work, and they were often working in silos. They were often doing this work. They were often the passionate educator doing this work. But, given a few years, they get burnt out, and that capacity was not being built across a whole school or across a whole organization. They're essentially standing alone saying, this is the way we need to go with their flashlight. But there weren't opportunities through professional learning, through collegial conversations, through shared curriculum planning necessarily to have this work shared. And the leadership for many of these institutions was saying, hey, this work is important, we believe in this work, but there wasn't the space created to have that conversation about vision and strategy around this work. And we're going to come back to that in a moment. So a little bit like Colleen Haggerty here, who's a Spanish teacher. She talks about the loneliness of being the only educator in her school doing this work. And this is just really very, very common for a lot of global educators in schools, is that they get the work, they're very passionate, but they're working in silos and they're not also upskilling their colleagues. So we created a framework, lots and lots of reading and research and looking at schools and drawing on experience and seeing that there was all these things happening in schools in silos. But what we need to do is we need to put it together. We need to put those pieces of the jigsaw together. And what does that take? Time, energy, commitment, leadership, vision, strategy, all these things that we've built into our framework. So all of this is great, but it is so much more powerful. Everybody is empowered, and deep learning can take place when those bits of the jigsaw are all put together. And in a moment, we'll look at what those bits of the jigsaw might be. So we created a framework to guide schools. And a little bit like Catherine Drown at Dimensions, which is a school in California, who I did some work with last year, she describes it so well. She talks about the desire that the school had to implement a global education program for several years. that was more than just a trip abroad, more than just a one-off experience. That is a powerful learning experience, but that's all that it is. They wanted to build a whole school culture for global citizenship or competence. They wanted to have an integrated and systematic system to this work. And they worked with me across a number of months, and we put together a comprehensive 3-year plan that had both short-term and long-term goals that really brought together everything they were doing. It audited what they were doing, and it created a roadmap forward as well to take the next step, either in new areas or the next step in existing areas to deepen and strengthen the work that they were doing. So what were those things that people were doing in schools? Well, there's 5 key areas that's part of our framework. So we've got school environment and culture, curriculum and languages, resources and digital technologies, additional programs, and community engagement. And these are all very, very broad areas, obviously, and some of these are done a little bit more than others. So we're going to see curriculum, obviously, in every single school and institution. Language programs, depending on mandates, is probably happening in every school. If it's optional, it's happening in some schools. If it's tertiary, it might not be happening. Well, it depends on the course, of course. And then we've got sort of, additional programs, and community engagements are always an interesting one because it's a very underutilized aspect of global competence and global citizenship education that can create powerful learning that is often missed. So we have these very large 5 key areas, and they're all interconnected and they're all interdependent. But of course, this is really deep work. So in this framework, as I mentioned earlier with the self-paced module, we broke down really what does it mean for curriculum languages? What does it mean for resources and digital technology? What does it mean for community engagement? What does it mean for school culture and environment? And we broke this down into A, B, C, D, E, so that when schools looked at this, it was really clear what we're talking about. With curriculum, we're looking at globally focused topics, including challenging topics addressed across the curriculum. We're talking about opportunities to connect with others internationally and nationally in their subject. We're looking at their language program linking across the curriculum to provide that meaningful learning for students, so that a languages program is not just done in isolation. Students can see the relevance of that beyond that, classroom at the end of the corridor. So we've got these 5 key areas and all of these points, and these are all very valid ways that a school or an institution can take action on global competence or global citizenship. Some of these develop one aspect of global competence, some of them develop multiple aspects of global competence, some of them are related to each other, some are a little bit more in isolation. But altogether, this essentially provides a kind of a framework or a menu. But we need to put it together, right? We don't only want to put those pieces of the puzzle together, but we want to connect the dots. What is happening already in the school? Because if you sat down, like I did with Dimensions and other schools, often when I sit down and I do that work with a core team that they've nominated to do this work, what they realize is they say, oh my goodness, we're already doing this and this and this. We've already got these units of work. We've actually got people in our school that link to this, and we have an international school program that's very underutilized. So it's about auditing and identifying what you're doing already, but it's also about connecting the dots and connecting the dots and putting it all together so it creates powerful learning and a whole school culture and ecosystem for global learning. So here we have Christopher Ansell. Christopher Ansell is an educator with a group called Leo Academies Trust in London. And I'm going to share this video with you. It's just 2 minutes long. And I'm just going to, I'd like you to think about all the different ways that they are building through their after school club global competence or global citizenship. All right, here we go. Just make sure I've got the shared sound on. Okay, make this nice and big. Okay, really passionate about building global learning at this group of schools that all work together. It's through a trust system. So let's hear from Christopher.
Hi there, my name's Mr. Christopher Ansell. I work at Leo Academy Trust and I am the International Schools and Mandarin Lead here in the UK. Just wanted to share with you all a little bit about the club that we run, the Mandarin Club. It's a weekly club that we run for our children in years 4, 5 and 6 across 4 of our schools. And it's a club aimed at developing, on one hand, the language and communication skills of our children, and on the other hand, really giving them an opportunity to understand other ways of living and becoming more informed and tolerant, active global citizens. So the lessons we run are through MEG, and they consist of half an hour of a live lesson with a native Chinese speaker, and then we follow this up with a kind of cultural active task for the children to, take their learning even further and in different directions. During the lessons, the children will have journals which they use to make notes, and these are really useful to use to refer to in the lessons and also reflect on afterwards. Another tool that we use is Google Classroom. So this is great for sharing the resources across our trust, and this allows our children, if they've learned anything during the lesson or if they've got anything particularly interested them, they can then take their learning further and kind of show their inquisitive nature, I suppose. We also use Twitter a lot to share all the great work that we do, so that's a really useful tool. We've seen some lovely pupil outcomes since we started our Mandarin program here, from on a small scale, just walking through the corridors and friendly ni haos, registration, to at the other end of the spectrum, children with a real strong desire to go and visit China. Now they know more about it and explore the rest of the world, beyond their local communities, which, to be honest with you, is exactly what we're setting out to achieve. Each lesson is always full of, I want to go there, or I want to try that. And that's, it's lovely. That's exactly the kind of attitude and we're looking to inspire in the children. Another outcome that we've noticed is the cultural capital that this club has provided the children. They've got a lot more knowledge to go and make connections with other areas of their learning. For example, recently we were learning about comparing the buildings and accommodation in the UK with China, and just that knowledge now that the children have about why Chinese people live in, or many Chinese people live in these tall apartment buildings. That's going to allow them to make connections in all other areas, especially any kind of human and physical geography lesson they ever do in the rest of their schooling careers. That's just one example. We've been learning, about food, about sport, about animals, festivals, ethnic groups. That's a lot of connections waiting to be happened that the children can then impart in other areas of their lives. In order to make all of the learning kind of impactful, relevant, purposeful, we have started developing some relationships with sister schools in China through our partners Global Schools Alliance and True Education partnerships. And we've had some nice kind of contact with those schools. We've done some online meetings, and that's been really successful. The children have enjoyed kind of seeing the lives of other children. That's been a real highlight.
Just gonna stop there. So just reflect on that video and think about what different ways did Mr. Ansell provide that their school is building opportunities for global citizenship or global competence. So they had a club where they were offering Mandarin, language and culture lessons, but how did that link to their curriculum? He talked about that cross-curriculum link. He also talked about connecting with a sister school over in China, so using digital technologies and as part of their sort of additional program. So with this work, it's not just one area that a school can be implementing. It's about also sitting down and saying, how can we build out what we're already doing to add different things in it, which is what's so powerful about the Leo Academies Trust, is that they didn't just have the club. They said, let's set up a sister school as well. Let's look at the cross-curriculum links. And they built out from that one area that they sort of decided to start with the clubs. So Obviously, we have all these different areas of learning and global education that are opportunities, and like a menu, you can kind of be selecting from these. But what we do need to ensure that these happen is we need to make sure that we have, if we go back here, we need to make sure that from a leadership, the title of today is about leading for global competence, is that there is a vision for the school and that there is a strategy that supports this, and there's an implementation plan, and that professional learning is happening, whether that's at leadership level, whether it's at educator whole school level, whether that's individual educators upskilling in a particular area, like setting up sister schools, setting up global collaborations, whether it's going and learning about curriculum redesign, pedagogies for deep learning that link to global learning. So thinking about what professional learning needs to happen in the school. And again, like with our sort of menu that we looked at earlier, we do have sort of deeper areas as well. So I just want to speak briefly about this idea of vision and mission, because if you look at school websites, or if you look at school or tertiary websites or their values, you'll often see these really great globally aligned missions or visions. Things like, our purpose is to develop young women of character and intellect who are equipped to make their unique contribution to the world, or we prepare boys to succeed in a world that is constantly being reinvented. And these are great visions because they encompass global learning. The school obviously understands that, this is the vision, this is the way forward, this is the education that needs to be provided. But as Greg Curtis says in his book, Moving Beyond Busy, what we need to be looking at is, what does this actually look like in practice? And how do we know we're actually achieving this? This is really high level, and it's a great start. This is our vision or our mission, might be linked into our values. But what is that next step? So the next step really is, we're looking at, okay, for a lot of schools, it's like, hey, we want to develop global citizens, and they've got a great vision. I say to do that, we might implement a sustainable development goals after school club, for example. But what we want to be doing is saying, what are the transformational goals that club will aim to achieve? Because this is just an action. This doesn't necessarily, depending on what goes on in it, necessarily develop global competence or global citizenship. What we've got to do is drill down to that next level, those transformational goals. Develop critical and creative thinkers, to foster innovation skills, to develop empathetic and respectful learners. And what we see when we actually nail down to these is, hey, it's not just an action. It's not just this action that we do this through. What we can do is we can do it through an SDG club. We can do it through the Harvard University Global Thinking routines built into our teaching and learning. We can do this through setting up a sister school relationship. We can do it through cross-curriculum units. So it's that ecosystem, it's that linking, it's that auditing, it's the connecting the dots that is happening in schools. And some of these might be happening already, and some might need to be introduced, and some might need to or be existing already, but may need revision and to be built on. So this is what the framework looks like. And you can see under A, vision, strategy, and implementation, that we've really broken down what does that mean. So committing to global competence, committing that clear vision to staff, students, and the community, not just staff, the whole community. Do students know what global learning is and why it's important and how it's being achieved in their school? Do parents know this? What does your strategic planning have? How is that reflecting your commitment to global learning? Do you have a team of people? Do you have people who have professional responsibilities for this area? The schools I've seen that do the most amazing work in this space all have somebody nominated to lead this work, not just do this work, lead this work, identify professional learning, identify strategic planning, and then roll that out across their school. You may need funding allocated, and of course reviewing this every year, because global learning is a dynamic, evolving area. We all know that, dynamic, evolving area that is constantly evolving. And professional learning, you need to be building that in as per relevance to what you're trying to achieve. That might be in person with a person doing consultancy like myself with the school. It might be through an online course. It might be through reading books. It might be through accessing communities through social media, which is something I'm really big on as well. It could be through any number of areas. So today I was sharing my experience working with schools across Australia, New Zealand, the US, and leading for global competence, and talking about how we can use a framework as a sort of essentially a menu to develop a globally competent school through a strategic plan, but through transformational goals, not just saying we're going to be doing a whole lot of actions, thinking deeper. And for that to happen, we need to create a priority for this work. We need to create a task force for this work. We need to create space and time for those conversations to take place. It's really important work. It's very exciting work. And if you want to learn a little bit more about it, you can scan this QR code here. It will take you to a form where you can find out more about this course and all the other courses we offer at MEG that are free. It's all free. So through here, you just sign up. It's been my absolute pleasure to share my experience. As I said at the beginning, I love connecting with people. I love sharing with people. If you are one of those people that is a global educator and you're really interested in connecting to communities, please reach out to me. I'm happy to connect people as well via Twitter or through my email. And you can always sign up to that course. I'd like to say thank you so much. Ka kite anō, take care. And that brings me to the end of my presentation. So thank you for your time today and joining me, and for your vision and committing to learning more about leading for global competence. I think this brings us to the Q&A. I'm not sure if we've got any questions today, but I'll just quickly check and see if there are any before we wrap up. I think we're good.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Lottie, for such an inspiring speech. Global competence is indeed crucial to citizens of the 21st century if they wish to adapt effectively. And MEG Languages is definitely one of the facilitators of this learning process. We would like to invite you to the Q&A session because I believe some of the audiences are very eager to give you some questions. We have received a lot of questions. However, due to time constraint, I'll be just able to pick out this one question, which I think is really elaborative and insightful. Do you think it will be a good idea to introduce 2 or more languages as compulsory learning in the school curriculum, and especially in locations where diversity is high? And if so, is there any way to make it engaging and interesting for students? Because a lot of them will be intimidated by having to study various foreign language while balancing other subjects in their education. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I feel like that question has probably about 3 parts to it.
Yes.
So I'll attempt to answer the different parts of it. First of all, languages education is incredibly important. We know from the research that the neuroplasticity of our brains increases, and it's not just about learning a language, not just about the creativity, the critical thinking, the listening skills that all develop. One of the things that also is really powerful with this is that students, through learning another language, they learn about another culture. So whether that's through 1 language or 2 languages, what they start to do is they don't just learn about, for example, I lived in China for a decade, so I'm somewhat familiar with some aspects of Chinese culture. But I didn't just learn about Chinese culture when I learned the language. I also reflected on my own culture. And I started to see that culture is, they say the fish doesn't see the water it swims in. That culture is not right or wrong. There's no value associated to it. That we are all different, and that culture is something that is just something that surrounds us. So we start to understand ourselves. We start to understand our own cultures when we learn about other cultures through language programs. we do live in an increasingly diverse world, correct? Here in Australia, the latest census said that 49% of Australians had a parent born overseas, and 23%, I think it's 22 or 23%, speak a language other than English at home. That is huge. That is huge. The diversity of Australia is increasing rapidly every year, and it is certainly not the only country to do so. Many countries, the diversity is increasing. If you look at the US, for example, there's huge diversity there. So speaking a language is going to open up a huge amount of opportunities, and the question was about is it worth learning two languages? If you look at job postings, and there's some really interesting data out there about this, the increase in job postings around bilingual speakers and those that are familiar through have intercultural skills and can work in multicultural or cross-cultural environments, either in person or these days it's on Zoom, is increasing. There is a huge demand for this. So yes, of course, the more languages, the better. The second part to that question talks about how do we make it engaging? And this is really, a really key question, and something at MEG that, we do a lot of work in, because we teach, our teachers are actually in country. So they develop and teach on Zoom to their students in primary and secondary schools. But what the students are doing is they're actually connecting with somebody in a different part of the world. They're seeing the seasons change. They're meeting their teachers and their families from a completely different culture. And they're creating a connection with somebody from another culture, and it is incredibly powerful. And it's not just the students that are learning like this, the educators in the classroom. We have hundreds of teachers in Australia, the US, that are building their intercultural competence through co-facilitating these programs. So I hope I've answered the question. It's, I think workload is always a huge question for everyone. We don't want to be adding on more and more and more for our students, but we do need to be thinking about offering to them, and also so they choose to do this work, but also educating them, sharing that data about job postings, sharing that data about the diversity, inspiring them to make those connections and make it exciting, make it interesting. Take them on virtual excursions, which is what we do at MEG. Take them on virtual excursions in country, show them 360-degree in-country footage of what is it like to take a train, in another country, in Colombia. What does a public park look like in China, where you see grannies doing fan dancing? So please, yes, offer that work. Inspire your students to be global learners, whether that's through a languages curriculum, or it's through global learning, or it's through additional opportunities. I've answered that probably in an extended format, but I felt like that question had three different parts. Back to you.
Yes. Thank you, Ms. Lottie. I believe that you have answered all of the parts of the questions, and your answer really gives more insights and inspire us to think, more about the questions. Due to a time constraint, we actually have to close the Q&A session right here, but we really hope that we will have the opportunity to discuss with you more about global educations and global competence. Once again, we would like to thank Ms. Lottie Dowling for your participation. And I would like to conclude all of the sessions of the exchange room. We would like to invite everyone back to the inquiry room to participate in our concluding remarks. Once again, on behalf of the organizing committee, we would like to thank you for joining Exploring Boundaries of Global Citizenship, and I wish that you have a good day. Thank you very much.